Good afternoon, everyone. I first want to thank you all for being here. So many friendly faces, great-looking group today. And I want you to know I really appreciate the support that you're giving to Deloitte for being here, and part of the discourse that Rhiannon talked about that we've all been engaged in. Certainly I feel support, so thank you personally. But I also want to say thank you for the work that we're all doing around this topic, because although we sometimes take credit for putting out reports, it is a collective compilation of perspectives and dialogue and work that is really being summarized in what we're putting forward. And I think it's a worthwhile endeavor that we all are very much committed to the success, the prosperity of this country. So that's really what I want to talk about today. And I'll use a little bit of our material to sort of bring that to life. You can see we've sprinkled some of it throughout. Shameless for sure, hopefully tasteful. We may have crossed the line where we started to brand the toothpicks on the desserts. But other than that, I'm going to do my best to try to keep this very substantive, and we'll talk about the subject matter at hand. Let me just dive into the essence of today's conversation. This quote is something that I think is very appropriate. The interesting thing as you read it is that, first of all, I agree with everything in it except one thing. It was actually provided by Wilfrid Laurier in 1904. He was referring to the 20th century. And so everything in it is something that I certainly hold true. I just believe it was 100 years too early. And I believe that this is the call to action for all of us in what the potential is for Canada in the 21st century, and in particular at this point in time that we're here today talking as a group. I think what I really want to zero in on is this notion that Rhiannon, I think, appropriately set up, which is what will it take for Canadian companies to achieve lasting success? True lasting success, not just to survive, not just to endure, but to thrive, to be truly, truly successful. And in doing that, securing a more inclusive and a more prosperous country for all of its citizens. And this notion of inclusive prosperity and inclusive growth is very much at the core of some of the material that we have been sharing and been engaging with a number of leaders. As business leaders, I know you're all very focused on the future. And I know a lot of the dialogue and a lot of the thinking tends to be fairly short to medium term in nature, because that's what we worry about day to day. But I know we also spend a lot of time worrying about the long term, worrying about where are we going. And in looking at this Canada at 175 work, sort of 25 years out, that's precisely what we're trying to bring to the fore and trying to address some of the big questions that impact our businesses, but also standing back and saying, what are the big questions that are critically relevant and important for our country? Things like, how will Canadian companies adjust to and address the disruption that is clearly in front of us over the next number of years? Who will develop that next generation of leaders in our country? How do we unlock the competitiveness that Canada has, and in particular, the competitive advantage that I think exists for our country when we talk about a more inclusive economic environment? And what does it look like to be a global leader? So these are the questions that really came up in the conversations that we have been pulling together across the country. And over the last few years, it's been a dialogue including government, academia, and business. And as we approached Canada's 150th birthday, we as a firm felt we had a role to play in helping to bring that together. And so we embarked on what was a multi-year research project, really focused on the future of Canada. And the future of Canada with this timeline that we picked, 25 years out at the time, Canada at 175. We tried to address a number of things. Real business performance issues like productivity, technology disruption, but also business imperatives that were a little bit more organic in nature, like courage and inclusion, cultural business imperatives. And we did this for two reasons. One, we see that as our responsibility. Given the nature of our organization, we're pan-Canadian, we've got significant scale, we're in offices across the country, and the nature of our organization is such that we develop leaders. We're a thinking organization, and this is something that we believe we needed with our access to pull together a forum and convene the kinds of conversations that we wanted to have. Second, we wanted to make sure that Canada remains one of the absolute best countries in the world to live, to learn, to grow, both professionally and personally. And so today, when we stand here, or as I stand here, you have to think about it in the context of why now and what are the critical issues that we're trying to address. And just as you think about what's happened over the last 10 years, what is on the horizon for the next 10, we are in a really interesting contextual sort of period of time, because you've got both significant economic change that's happened in the last 10 years and a lot of uncertainty over the next 10. And I think probably only outdone by the level of geopolitical uncertainty that's in front of us. And for me, uncertainty certainly is something that creates challenges, but I think more importantly than that, uncertainty creates massive opportunity. It does for countries, it certainly does for businesses. I am a glass half full kind of person, and I think that what we have in front of us in the next number of years is a situation where the opportunities significantly outstrip the challenges. I've seen in the businesses I've been involved in, our own organization, the practices I've been involved in, but also the clients that I advise, and many of you here are not only running businesses and are business leaders, but you're advisors to clients. And you've seen the situations where organizations can truly cement significant positive step change in periods of uncertainty or in periods of flux. And those are the organizations that just do that extra level of work, that extra level of detail and preparedness, that deliberate thinking. It's almost a mindset. And I've often seen when organizations do that in these particular periods of time, that's when you can cement success for decades to come. And so that is clearly an opportunity for our businesses in front of us, but it's also a critical opportunity for Canada and the country. So let me just take you back, because I talked about the context of going back as much as a decade. If you go back a decade, that's right in the heart of the global financial crisis. And we all know that it impacted certainly every country around the world. It impacted our country, every industry, coast to coast. And at the time that I was in the midst of my role in this global financial crisis, I had just assumed a global leadership role. I joined the global executive that Rhiannon made reference to. I was sort of 1 year in, leading one of our 4 global businesses. And it happened to be the advisory part of our firm, which during the global financial crisis became a discretionary activity for companies. So you can imagine, I got this new role, I'm on the executive, I'm excited, this thing happens in the marketplace, and I'm going around the world, and the impact is substantive. For about 9 months, what I was selling, what our business was delivering, was pretty much put on hold. And so in that, there was certainly trauma, there's stress, and everyone was feeling it around the world. Many of you in the industries you're involved in certainly saw it. But the thing that really I found most important as a learning experience is it is the time in our organization where we did the most significant level of building of our advisory practice. Because as we were being impacted, we had elements of our organization, the other 3 parts of the firm, that had business as usual. We were delivering audits, we were delivering tax work, and it created a base from which we could find an opportunity to build off of, and the sense of stability that allowed us to make some choices and some bets. And so we were able in that time to attract people into our organization that we would never have attracted in the decades previously, that were looking for a different home, that had a different level of stability and opportunity going forward. And so there was this sense of opportunity in the middle of challenge, in the middle of uncertainty, in the middle of crisis. The other thing that I found that I think is particularly relevant for today is I was a Canadian going around the world at that time, and Canadians were very significantly welcomed, embraced. People were looking for our perspective. Part of it was the stories people heard about how we were weathering the financial crisis, the stability of our system, often our banking system, but kind of the nature in which we approach things. People wanted to know our story, because what I did see was the way in which things were being impacted. There was some significant variation in both reactions and approaches around the world to what we were all encountering. And the Canadian view was something that people really were seeking out. So, what else did we learn from this, though? We weathered the storm. We certainly did well in Canada. But if you look, though, at what happened in the years subsequent to the global financial crisis, we didn't have in Canada the significant growth spike that some other nations did. And I think this is important, and it's an important perspective for us to have going forward. Because, sure, we managed the downside. We did that extremely well, and we always want to jealously guard the ability to do that. But we were not prepared for the upside in the way that other nations were. We didn't capitalize on it. So we won in the short term. We certainly were able to address the negative side of things, but we were not particularly poised, positioned, or had the mindset or the level of readiness and preparation to really take off in the years to come. And to me, I think that is at the core of the conversation that we have today as we think about the uncertainty in front of us. So post-2008, it's been often used term, this age of disruption, wasn't a time frame when Canada distanced itself from the pack. If anything, we sort of sustainably, certainly compared to our neighbor to the south, experienced a decrease in things like productivity, GDP. Even if moderate in some years, over the course of a 10-year period, it added up. So whether you call it socioeconomic patriotism or enlightened self-interest, this is the challenge that we wanted to take on at Deloitte, and certainly I wanted to take on. As I was coming into my role, elected in my role in 2011, at the same time we launched this research study that focused on things like productivity. And when we started in those early days of the research and the discourse with business leaders, it affirmed things that we probably knew inherently, intuitively. And that was that the significant underinvestment in Canada in things like people and technology in particular led to us having some of this lack of competitiveness, because those were some of the key ingredients that lead to growth and to significant transformation. As we dug deeper, the root of this came from the fact that as Canadians, we have this really strong aversion to risk. Certainly on a relative scale, we have an aversion to risk, or said differently, an overemphasis on comfort. And so this is something that we need to address, and it's not the responsibility of government alone or not the responsibility of other key leaders. This is a responsibility of all of us, and that's why we convened groups that included government, academia, and business. We needed to address the fundamental underpinnings of leadership and culture, both in Canadian businesses, but also in the Canadian ecosystem overall. And so in 2016, we actually launched our Future of Canada platform, dealing with Canada at 175 and all the branding and the material that you see around here, you hear today. That is sort of the series of activity that we jumped in concert with many other organizations, friends, many of you in the room today that have been heavily involved in the forums around the country, you know, whether they were groups of 10 or groups of 60, spending sometimes hours, sometimes a couple of days at a time, really digging into these topics. The first of these topics that we launched into was this notion of courage. That came to the forefront when we asked the question, what is it going to take to actually make these tough decisions? And courage has been something we've all heard about. It's been the focus of an exploration, a discussion for a long period of time. We've all heard stories of moral courage, whether that's stories about Mandela or Gandhi or Martin Luther King, but we often didn't hear about them specifically in a business context. and specifically with the level of specificity that allowed us to quantify or define the ingredients necessary to have courage in an economic context, in a business context, and in driving a nation. And so when we did the work, 5 critical imperatives came to the forefront around this research. And that was, for an organization to be truly courageous, it needed to have or display 5 concurrent elements: challenging the status quo, taking calculated risks, always doing what's right, setting a leadership tone and cascading it through the organization in a way that focused on the most critical issues, and this notion of uniting to include. How do we truly create an inclusive environment where we bring the best of Canada to the forefront and the best of our diversity as a real asset? So, the report also had some other findings that you might consider particularly interesting. When we actually then compared this against the full set of businesses that we studied in Canada, we came to the conclusion that only 11% of Canadian companies could consider themselves or could actually be seen to be truly courageous, although 50% of companies thought that they were. And Deloitte found themselves exactly in that situation. We were not in the 11% of truly courageous companies, but if you were to ask us, we thought that we were. And that was a fairly typical phenomenon when you compare that against many phenomenal, iconic, very successful organizations in our ecosystem. The good news is that approximately 1/3 of Canadian companies are on the cusp, meaning in one, potentially 2 of those areas that we're talking about, we were just short or we needed to address. And the other good news that came out of the work that we did is that these areas were addressable. These are things that were actionable that we could work on. So in 2016, we brought our partners together for a 2.5-day meeting focusing on nothing but this element of courage and what would it take and how would we move forward as an organization. And many other Canadian companies have done very similar things in forums like that. I think it's important because when you look at who the courageous organizations are and were, they are the organizations that typically invest in R&D much more aggressively than the non-courageous organizations. They experience much more growth and transformative, positive change that sets them up for future success. So it's worth the price to go for that. In 2017, we came out with a second report. It was all about bold bets. And this was really about bold bets for a country, for a nation, and the kind of deliberate action that would need to be taken. It called for strategic thinking, strategic action plans. And when you think about bold bets, what are they? They're complex, they're contentious, and they're difficult. It's hard to take a bold bet in an organization because even though there's high reward, there's high risk, and the reward tends to lag. The average tenure of a CEO is 6 to 7 years. You would say the same thing for the average tenure of a university president or often political leaders. So the people that came together in this business, government, academia trifecta needed to make decisions for the long term with benefits for the long term, but the risk would be felt typically in the short term. Hard to do. Easy to say, hard to do. That's the challenge that we have collectively tried to come across in the kind of work that we've done. And in doing that, we only have to look back on our own history to understand the benefits that accrue from taking that kind of long-term action and having the courage to make the bold bets. Things like the Canada Pacific Railway. So a promise to British Columbia, but look at what it's done to unite a nation. Universal health care, a best practice that we saw in one province of Saskatchewan. Look what it's done for the building of our nation and our social fabric. Confederation itself. These are long-lasting bets that have redefined who we are and created this unbelievable platform for us, which very similarly can be applied to Canada in the context today and to many of our organizations. So when we did the work on bold bets, and similarly we went out and engaged Canada, businesses, government, academia in total, 3 things came out as the bold bets that this group collectively said we must make. Number 1, we have to build global champions. This is not the government picking which company in Canada will be the global champion. It's creating conditions within our industry sectors that will allow global champions to truly emerge. Two, we have to address regulatory barriers, but not just regulation in an esoteric way. We have to think about regulation very proactively and actually look at ways of creating conditions for success. So when we talk about, for example, wanting to look at immigration and the practices we have around immigration in Canada, how do we get on our front foot to make sure that we're attracting the very best people, the very best companies into Canada? Bringing white glove treatment to the table to ensure that we are reducing the timelines to get people to have the kind of approvals and the kind of experience coming into this country that really sets us apart. And we have a massive advantage relative to our neighbors to the south right now. We all know about that very clearly. And a third, taxes. We have to address our tax regime in a way that makes it a positive differentiator going forward. Now, coming off of that discussion, there was a sense that we needed to understand what makes us most competitive as a nation. And one of the things we were asked to do on behalf of the Business Council of Canada, this is a group of about 100 CEOs in Canada that come together regularly throughout the year, trying to address issues relevant to the nation. We were asked to take on a piece of work to build a competitiveness scorecard, a dashboard that we would constantly come back and revisit and assess how's Canada doing. And in looking at that competitive scorecard, what we did is we came up with a system of scoring that looked at 12 comparator nations across 9 dimensions of competitiveness, and we ranked either positively or kind of negatively across a dimension of these. On the positive side, we were at the very top of the charts on talent. You just think about Canada, our commitment to diversity, one of the best education systems in the globe, and certainly some of the things that are in place around immigration and other elements that really allow us to be a place that not only attracts top talent and develops top talent, but brings in more and more of the kinds of catalysts for success that we need. On the other end of the scale, and I've alluded to it already, regulation and taxes had us right at the bottom and trending the wrong way over the last number of years. So when we looked at that, we said we need to do a deeper dive into some of these areas, both the good and the bad, to understand how we truly capitalize on this success and turn it into something that is a real asset that we can leverage much more aggressively. Inclusion was at the core of the dialogue around talent. That is what defined Canada as a nation and defined our competitive advantage. It's what is authentically us, and we needed to leverage what is authentic. And from the research that we've all done, many of us in this room know that performance and culture drive directly from an inclusive environment, that we see elevated levels of success when that exists. But when we look across the landscape in Canada, Canadian companies generally are moving too slowly, often using outdated approaches to inclusion and diversity, in some cases 40-year-old approaches to inclusion and diversity. And we spend way too much time counting differences and cataloging differences to measure diversity, as opposed to how do we create environments that are truly inclusive. Deloitte's not immune to this. Now, we're proud of a lot of the step changes that we've made, but one of the promises that I put on the table 4 years ago in this role was that Deloitte would have in our talent pool at all levels a situation that reflected truly and fully the Canadian dynamic, that the Canadian population would be represented in all levels. We have that at our entry level. We have more than 50% women coming in and more than the Canadian average for visible minorities and in some cases other elements of diversity. But when you look at our partner ranks, traditionally we brought in 10 to 20% of our partners as women, and that was our group. We were at about 17 or 18% women in our partner ranks, our most senior ranks in the firm. So we committed to doing that differently. Over the last 3 years, we've done reasonably well, but we've fallen short. So we've been, each of the last 3 years, between 40 and 44% women entering into our partnership. Good, but not great, not the goal. So we found ourselves up on the step change, but we have another step change to go. So looking at ourselves, we know we're part of the problem still that exists in the country, and we have to be part of the solution. It was the element, by the way, that held us back from being a truly courageous company. So we're going to get this done. We have to get it done hopefully this year. We have a lot of leaders around the table that are making those decisions. Hopefully we'll make it happen this year. But leaders need to live it. We need to live inclusion. We need to live it in our business environment. We need to live it in our communities. And it's not something we can punt to a future generation. And for Canada overall, we've got to move beyond being nice, being open, and being tolerant. Those are all great things. Let's jealously guard that. Let's keep that. But we have to be more than that. We have to actually bring deliberate purpose to the table, and we have to build it into our processes in everything that we do so that we're a country that truly is on its front foot, moving forward aggressively with real clear goals in mind. So, just recently, a couple of months ago, we launched our most recent report, and the one that I believe is asking the most important question to date, which is what is necessary to create true, lasting business success in this country and beyond. And as part of that work, we launched this notion of the infinite organization and a number of findings that came out of the report to support that. We talked to 700 organizations as part of the survey work and part of the engagement in reaching our findings. And we found that 55% of those organizations felt that they were truly poised for lasting success. Not 100, only 55. The reality is something closer to half of that are actually really poised for that kind of success. Furthermore, in Canada, we have what we call a zombie problem. So when we looked back over the last 10 years, going back from 2009 to pretty much to date, any organization that had 3 consecutive years of stagnant or negative growth was considered a zombie organization. 44% of the companies in Canada have that condition. That's an issue. That's something we all have to address, and the fundamental things we've been talking about at the underpinnings of who we are will address that. But we've also had a phenomenon where we have unbelievable, amazing growth companies that we also have to get behind, support, and understand those success stories so that we replicate them over and over again. And as part of the findings, there were 5 things, 5 behaviors that we really anchored on that found its way to the forefront very, very clearly. Companies that wanted to have lasting success needed to address these 5 areas. Number 1, purpose and impact. Now, we've all talked about purpose. We've heard about purpose over the last number of years, and we all know that there are positive benefits for engagement and so on. But coming back to what I was saying earlier at the outset, purpose is one of the most critical, if not the most critical things for an organization to address uncertainty and disruption. It's a critical ingredient going forward with what we're about to address in the next decade as a nation. Second, we have to disrupt with resilience. So as organizations, we have to disrupt proactively, and we have to stick to it. It's not flavor of the month. It's not an initiative for a year or two that you try and then you pull off of. You stick with it with resilience, and if you do that, you get the long-term benefits, sometimes with the short-term pain. Number 3, somewhat on the same vein, pursuing tough decisions. We have no trouble as a group of Canadian companies diagnosing the tough decisions that have to be made. We have some trouble embracing tough decisions when they're essentially forced on us. We're not as good pursuing them proactively when they know they're there, and where sometimes we believe there's the opportunity to push that out for future groups to deal with. We have to nurture our roots. We have to understand what has made us successful, what's given us the license to be the kind of organization that we were in the first place. In our organization, that's people and clients. Can't have the best people without the best clients and vice versa. But in understanding your roots, you can't just stick with those as some sort of staid level of condition that's static. You have to look at the newness in that. In our organization, we're pushing ourselves to embrace and empower millennials. They are the future of our organization, and they're the ones that really have to take us through the disruption over the next 10 to 20 years. And we have to assert global leadership. One of the things that came out in the work that we did with companies is they said we have to, as Canadians, look beyond simply exporting as the definition of global success. That global success going forward will have other elements to it. We need to create real relationships, real channels of success, strategic partnerships with nations around the world. Our government has actually helped us a lot. We're the only nation in the G7 that has a trade agreement today with all other G7 countries. So the government is doing their part as well. This is a business imperative, it is an academic imperative, and it is a government imperative collectively that we all have to do. And if we address this as a group collectively, I'm convinced we're going to move from being one of the best places to live and work in the world to the very best place to live and work in the world. So I'm going to just come back to where I started, and that's to say thank you for being here. And thank you for your engagement to date over the last couple of years as we've been on this journey in a pretty substantive way. I'm hoping we collectively will continue to spark debate. More importantly, we're going to take action, and we're going to collaborate in an open network. The work that we're doing, the work that we're publishing, isn't meant to be proprietary Deloitte. It's meant to be shared and built on and worked with, and many of you have done that. We've partnered with people like Cisco in mental health and Sobeys in work that we've done to employ individuals involved in the Special Olympics, and other types of things that are going to change not only the discourse, but the kind of actions that we need to take as Canadians collectively in this business community. We have to avoid the future simply unfolding, and if we do that, we're going to realize it's not a zero-sum game. Working together, we have a chance to really elevate Canada to the kind of country that we talked about and was quoted by Wilfrid Laurier back in 1904, that we will make happen in this century. So on that note, thank you very much. I know I was standing in the way of you and food. Hopefully you still have time to grab a toothpick and some dessert, but I think you'll have a little more time than that. Thank you. I really appreciate the time and attention, and happy to engage with any of you in the weeks and the months to come. Take care. Thank you.